Torrential rains dropped on the Jordan area Friday night, May 20th, 1960, bringing the city to its most devastating flood. This flood routed some 110 families from their homes. Throughout the night, members of the Jordan Fire and Police Departments, along with many other volunteer helpers, battled the raging waters of Sand Creek in efforts to evacuate families from flooding homes in more than a third of the residential area of the city. Sand Creek, a normally placid stream, wound through the city from the southeast to the northwest, and it was this area of town that was flooded. A stretch of Highway 21 in the city limits, which parallels Sand Creek for some 500 feet between the old brewery and the ballpark, was cut away with more than half the road washed out. Property damage was estimated at nearly $750,000. In the early morning hours, the sandstone bridge on Varner Street leading to the park from the business and residential section of town was washed out, and a 30-foot section of blacktop road was cut through at a spillway on the east side of the 10-acre mill pond. Water gushed through the opening, adding to the already flood-battered town. Mrs. Joseph Swingler, age 59, died of a heart attack while preparing to move articles from her home during the storm. 3 rescue workers, Gino Taddy, Matt Bush, and Tom Doobie, sustained slight injuries when swept off their feet and carried 250 feet down a hillside by the swirling water. Jordan rescue teams heroically fought the surging waters while bringing out evacuees in available boats. One boat, while empty, eventually capsized and sank. Ropes for guidelines were stretched from tree to tree along some streets. About 3:30 a.m., a call was made for outside help. Sheriff W.B. Schroeder and the Shakopee Fire Department were notified, and the Sheriff's Department radioed for additional help. By daybreak Saturday, helicopters, powerboats, trucks, and cars were pressed into service to evacuate families. Rescue squads from Scott, Hennepin, Ramsey, Washington, and Carver County Sheriff Departments poured into town. Navy men from Wold Chamberlain Airport, along with 2 Navy and 1 Army helicopter, joined the rescue operations. The American Red Cross set up an emergency shelter for evacuees and workers in St. John's Catholic Church basement. The churchyard was used as a headquarters for rescue vehicles, radio unit. National Guardsmen were ordered into town late Saturday at the request of Sheriff Schrader. Governor Freeman sent a 50-man unit from Northfield. The National Guard unit was under the command of Major Quist and Captain Cruz. Governor Freeman flew to Jordan and surveyed the flood-stricken area in a Navy helicopter. Conferring with Schroeder and Harry Sieben, Traffic Safety Director for Minnesota Highway Department, Freeman said it appeared that Jordan would be declared a disaster area and that state aid would be necessary. Rain, which fell continuously for a 22-hour period, measured unofficially more than 8 inches. Starting about 5 p.m. Friday, a steady rain continued, much of the time coming in torrents. The first call to the fire department for help came from the Gino Taddy resident about 9:45, asking for assistance to help clean a clogged hillside drain. Water was gushing down the hillside into their home. After the first request for help, the fire department received a continual flow of calls throughout the night. Rural areas also suffered considerable water damage, with many low-lying acres underwater. Some farmers said they would lose a good bit of their cash income because of the heavy rainfall. Under the leadership of Mrs. Mamie Schrader, Edward F. Smith, and Ronnie Wheeler, and Mrs. William Bramhorse and Mrs. Herb Strait of Jordan, the Scott County Red Cross chapter was on the job immediately following the flash flood in this area. Working with civil defense workers who were in charge of the evacuation work, dry clothing was immediately available to those who needed it. And through the fine work of Red Cross volunteer canteen workers, coffee, donuts, sandwiches, and full hot meals were available to disaster victims and to civil defense and other volunteer workers. An estimated 1,700 meals were served to some 150 disaster victims and 132 volunteer workers from Saturday morning through Sunday night. Many things went down the stream in the historic flood, but probably no one lost any more single pieces of property than Herb Trost at the Jordan Sawmill. Situated near Sand Creek at the south edge of Jordan, the sawmill was plundered of 125 cords of slab wood and 10,000 feet of lumber by flood waters. Many of the boards ended up scattered around town, many went down the stream. 2 caskets and 3 mattresses also floated from a warehouse at Nolden's funeral home. Over 30 mattresses were moved from the warehouse before floodwaters became too deep. For many days afterward, cleanup crews continued the task of cleaning dirt and debris from mud-covered Jordan left by the ravaging flood. Tons of silt were hauled from town. On some street corners, mud was deposited 2 to 3 feet deep, and along many streets it was gutter deep, as well as several inches deep over many lawns. Crews from various places worked all week at the cleanup. Local rainfall recordings showed that 7.61 inches of rainfall fell during the storm period on May 20th and 21st. Other areas in the watershed may have been hit harder. Excessive rainfall combined with what fell during the week and the already waterlogged soil brought about the damaging flood. Jordan's flood made national news, with accounts appearing in newspapers, on radio and TV from coast to coast, as well as in some newspapers in foreign countries. Attempts to aid rescue operations with this heavy trench-digging truck the night of the flood backfired for Wally Stocker, and he ended up being rescued himself. He drove his truck into the swift-flowing current, which gushed over First Street to pull out boats being pushed by Jordan firemen and rescue operations. A huge tree stump, carried along by the stream, caught under the rear wheels of the truck, and he was unable to move. About that time, 3:30 a.m., one boat sank and floodwaters were getting worse. Gene Schmidt and Richard Hartman, working in the water, jumped on the truck, and the 3 were marooned for about an hour before help arrived. Jerry Stocker eventually drove down the flooded street with a county grader, and the 3 rode out on it. Jordan, Minnesota experienced one of its worst disasters in May of 1960, when floodwaters up to 6 feet deep in places covered more than a third of the residential area of Jordan.